Brexit was the single most monumental socio-economic decision undertaken in Europe in the 21st century, and there's no two ways about it. The decision to withdraw from the European Union came as a surprise to people living outside of the UK, but a long time coming to British citizens. The EU had become an increasingly polarized entity in the UK, and in many parts of Europe, enough for voter turnout of the 2016 referendum to set new records. People desperately wanted out of the alliance, and that's what they ultimately got in 2020. But we're a few years past the official withdrawal, and it's time to answer the question that was posed even as Brexit's divorce agreement was being signed. Was this the right move for the people of the United Kingdom? Will they regret it afterward? Or will the European Union scramble without the UK? A lot of questions were left unanswered for far too long. But today we're taking a look at the real winners and losers after Brexit. In 2016, at the time of the Brexit referendum, Britain was contributing 20 billion euros towards the European Union budget. In subsidies, the country got back 7 billion, less than half of what it had given. As one of the strongest economies among the EU member states, Britain was also one of the budget's largest contributors, but Germany was the single largest. In the years following Brexit, or even when a non-deal Brexit was being proposed, the subject of the UK's contribution towards the EU budget was brought up several times over. It was estimated that Germany would have to foot a 2.25 billion additional bill toward the budget because of the UK's withdrawal. Germany was the largest contributor, and still is. You see, when the UK couldn't come to terms with Brexit on its withdrawal, it threatened to enact Article 50 and walk away with a no deal. Simply, this meant that Britain would be granted a clean exit from the alliance. Yes, that was always a possibility, but the UK saw the EU as much more than its former alliance. It now viewed the alliance as its new customer, potentially its biggest one. A few things to bear in mind here. The UK played its economy as its strongest, admittedly only, playing card. That plus the fact that it lacked significant foresight when it believed that the EU would be its biggest customer. Yes, the free movement was coming to an end, and so was the UK's place in the single market. Still, the UK's biggest customer wasn't the EU. It was, and still would have been, EU member states. A state, for example, like Germany. When it came to talking about winners and losers in the fallout of Brexit, let's start off by talking about Britain's relationship with Germany in a post-Brexit world. Likewise, does Germany harbor any resentment toward the UK for withdrawing and leaving it to pay the difference? There was a chance, but maybe not in the way the United Kingdom had hoped. Prior to the Brexit vote, Germany enjoyed a strong traditional relationship with the UK. To put this into perspective, Germany exports into the country were close to 90 billion euros in value in 2015. That was 1 year before the nation decided to withdraw from the EU. Likewise, 1 year before the UK actually withdrew, that's 2019, this number fell to a little under 80 billion pounds. We have to ask, why? But the answer's pretty straightforward. The UK's exit from the single market. Realistically, Germany wasn't too keen on the costs and rules that came from the exit, and that would now be employed for the EU-UK trade. De Status, Germany's statistical office, reported that imports dropped to 32 billion euros in 2021. This is an overall drop of 8.5% from the previous year, and saw the UK lose its status as one of the top 5 largest trade partners for Germany. The London School of Economics has predicted that trade with EU countries could decrease by around a third over the next 10 years. So, what do you do when you have a problem? Naturally, Germany needed a solution. In this case, the only way to mitigate the loss from Brexit trade was to look elsewhere, which they did. Germany strengthened their trading agreements with member states and further afield. There was a raise of 16.8% in exports from Germany to other EU countries, and a 20.8% increase in exports to China. Overall, there was a wave of goods imports into Germany that resulted in a 17.1% rise to 1.2 trillion euros in 2021. So far, it seemed that Germany had managed to get away with a clean exit. However, as socioeconomic changes usually go, this wasn't wholly the case. In fact, Britain's exit from the EU did have an economic impact on the member states. The European Commission in 2021 deduced that Brexit would cost Germany 35 billion euros in the years to come. The UK was in fact one of the largest contributors to the EU's budget, second only to Germany. In the aftermath of Brexit, the expectations fell on the remaining states to pick up where the UK left off. Naturally, Germany had to pick up most of the slack. Germany did suffer, although admittedly the UK suffered more. According to the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy and Economic Effect of a Brexit on the German and European economy published in 2017, Brexit would be significantly more expensive for the United Kingdom than for Germany in all events. Brexit would affect the EU 27 states differently. Overall, the further the geographic and cultural distance from the UK, the lower the losses for the respective states. Taking Germany as an example, the largest relative drop in value added in the German economy would potentially be seen in pharmaceutical products, in the automotive and machine building industries. However, some service sectors may stand to benefit from Brexit, including the financial sector and IT services. We'll start this section off with an interesting fact. Did you know that Frexit, that's the hypothetical French exit from the EU, was once a bigger reality than Brexit? Admittedly, not as big as Grexit. That's a Greek exit from the alliance. In June 2016, just a month before the 2016 Brexit referendum, the Pew Research Center conducted a poll in selected EU member states, asking the question, "Are you happy with your country being in the EU?" Starting with the country that ended up leaving the EU, 48% of Britishers answered no, stating that they had an unfavorable outlook of the EU. In contrast, 61% of French citizens replied with the same, and 70% of Greeks expressed their unhappiness. Later on, after the Brexit referendum had taken place, the poll was repeated, and the results showcased 60% of French citizens now had a favorable view of the EU. Between the first poll and the second one, only one thing changed: Brexit. If you thought the British wanted out of the alliance, you must not have heard of the Marine Le Pen's 2017 presidential campaign, wherein the leader of the Front National promised French citizens a referendum of their own should she be elected. She wasn't, and all talks of a referendum were subsequently squashed. Frexit didn't happen. It still hasn't happened, and the outlook currently is that it might never happen. That would primarily be because the French saw the impact Brexit had on the United Kingdom. Moving away from what happened to Britain, however, let's talk about how Brexit impacted the French in their dealings with the English. Unsurprisingly, trade slowed down. To reiterate, the UK thoroughly believed that they could seize the opportunity via Brexit to make EU 27 their biggest customer. That didn't happen. If anything, leaving the single market only complicated their trade relationships with the member states, and they began to focus elsewhere. Why? Ease, of course. A year after Brexit checks were introduced and implemented, 79% of businesses with French trading partners reported trade holdups to the Associated Press. These delays are worsening too, even taking 42% of businesses an extra 2 to 3 weeks to import from France compared to their usual import times. The EU 27 enjoys basic EU trading rights, which prevents countries from imposing international barriers against goods or services from other member states. Combining this with the new border controls on imports that since Brexit's introduction have been delayed again and again, this has a serious impact on the supply chain. In effect, France has no choice but to look elsewhere. The big losers in Brexit will be the British, said Bruno Le Maire, Minister of the Economy, Finance and Economic Recovery of the French government. On December 24, 2020, a trade and cooperation agreement was reached between the United Kingdom and the European Union. This agreement determines the applicable rules to relations in a number of areas, including their trade relations. The agreement made it possible to maintain trade without customs duties or quotas. However, the British left the European common market. Companies now had to identify themselves to French customs, and if they were importing into the UK, to British customs. They also had to review their trade agreements with their British partners to find out who was financially and legally responsible for the goods. Finally, they needed to renegotiate with carriers the extent of their obligations. This, however, impacted the French just as much as it did the British. Before a new normal could be set up, and France could mitigate the loss it incurred, it had to, well, incur the loss. One report suggested that until France does that, the country should expect losses of close to €2 billion a year. The new normal was reached in 2020, and reports showed that exports to the UK reached €33.6 billion, while imports hit €21.1 billion. This makes Britain the 6th and 7th largest customer and supplier to France respectively, and the changes will have an impact on the economy. When results of the 2016 referendum were read out, it became clear that the people of the United Kingdom wanted out of the UE. This was simply because the number of Leave voters outnumbered the Remain voters. A small margin with 51% in the majority, but a margin nonetheless. That being said, the results weren't as straightforward as you'd think. The United Kingdom is made up of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The results were tallied from each nation and combined, therefore giving the Leave voters a definite majority. But did you know that the results of the referendum motivated talks of independence across Northern Ireland and Scotland? The results were fair, if you'd like to call it that, because the majority of the people in the UK wanted to leave. However, if we're talking about numbers, the majority resides within England. To put this into perspective, 53% of people in England voted to leave, and 55% of voters in Northern Ireland voted to stay. Likewise, a majority in Scotland voted to stay, whereas a majority in Wales voted to leave. The results reflected the decision of the majority, and that majority happened to live within England. Unsurprisingly, this led to talks of independence from the United Kingdom, but that's for another video. Right now, we're going to talk about what the results mean for Northern Ireland. You have to remember that Ireland in itself is a separate state and is a member of the EU 27. This made the withdrawal agreement drafted by a joint committee of UK officials and EU members a bit tricky. The withdrawal agreement includes a binding protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland that's primarily designed to prevent a hard border on the island. The protocol was a major priority during the withdrawal agreement negotiations and creative, workable solution to protect all island economy, the single market, and the Good Friday Agreement was required. Brexit has made frictionless trade between the EU and the UK impossible, but the protocol is a complex system that allows Northern Ireland to remain in the UK customs territory and, at the same time, benefit from access to the single market for the movement of goods. It contains provisions that protect unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, such as the continuation of the common trade travel area between Ireland and the UK. It also allows for north-south cooperation in areas of mutual benefit, such as agriculture, transport, education, tourism, and the single electricity market. The peace funding programs that support peace and reconciliation and promote economic and social progress in Northern Ireland and the border regions of Ireland are also continuing under withdrawal agreement commitments. Despite the EU and the UK reaching an agreement on the protocol, problems emerged when it came to applying the new rules. Complicated custom checks on goods imported from Britain but destined to stay in Northern Ireland were causing frustration on the ground, and there were issues with measures regarding agri-food, medicines, state aid, and VAT. However, the protocol was designed to be amendable so that unforeseen challenges to its implementation can be addressed by EU-UK joint committees. This allowed for further EU-UK negotiations, which, in March 2023, led to the formal adoption of an agreement called the Windsor Framework that addresses practical difficulties in implementing parts of the protocol. The framework simplifies checks on goods arriving in Northern Ireland from Great Britain by introducing green and red lanes. Goods staying in Northern Ireland use green lanes for pre-registered trusted traders, requiring minimal paperwork and no regular checks. Goods moving into the EU single market are directed to red lanes for customs checks. To protect the single market, the UK grants EU officials access to its customs systems. In addition to the protocol, Ireland has received financial aid from the Brexit Adjustment Reserve, a €5.37 billion fund helping those most affected by Brexit. Ireland received €1 billion, the largest share, with payments of €361.5 million in 2021, €276.7 million in 2022, and €282.2 million in 2023. The protocol for Ireland and Northern Ireland was essential to the withdrawal agreement, alongside protecting citizens who benefited from EU membership rights. Northern Irish citizens who chose to be Irish remain EU citizens, retaining their freedom to live and move within the EU. The UK has agreed to uphold these rights. The withdrawal agreement also guarantees the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens in the EU member states at the end of the transition period. It protects their family members' rights, ensuring they can join them. These rights follow the conditions of EU law on free movement, including the need for work, resources, or health insurance. The European Commission monitors citizens' rights in the EU, while an independent authority oversees them in the UK. Irish citizens' rights in the UK remain protected under the Common Travel Area. The real question in the aftermath of the United Kingdom taking a momentous decision that would impact the future of socio-economic and political relations within Europe was, what about the working class? A few things to bear in mind here. The free movement made life easier for many Eastern Europeans as they moved further west to find employment. In this case, once Poland became an EU 27 state in 2004, Poles flooded Western Europe in large numbers, eagerly seeking employment. The image of a Polish plumber was popularized, although, admittedly, this hypothetical character was more polarized than popular. People in other EU states were worried about the fate of their jobs. Particularly, Poles could get the job done in half the time and for much less because of labor laws. Naturally, companies would prefer hiring them and other Eastern European nationalities. This was actually a point of contention during the 2016 referendum and was one of the reasons why the British voted to leave the alliance. Many believed that migrants were flooding in and stealing their jobs. They obviously didn't take into account the fact that the Poles could only take up jobs that were left behind by the British. To put this into perspective, Poles dominated the farming sector and the hospitality industry. At the time when they took over primary employment in these sectors, they were severely underemployed, partly because of the menial work that was required, and partly because these sectors didn't pay as well as others. Poles didn't steal jobs, they just took the ones that British citizens didn't want. However, this was a far-fetched concept to explain to the average Leave voter back in 2016, who was determined to end the free movement. In the end, they did, but then Britain had to fly in Poles and other Eastern European ethnicities to help them fill up the labor shortage. That's right, in a bizarre twist, the Brits needed the Poles more than they needed them. After COVID-19 ended, there was a massive delay in the supply chain wherein the farming sector needed more hands. Free movement had just ended, which meant that so did seasonal employment. To be fair, the Brits borrowed the idea of flying in migrant workers from the Germans, who also needed Poles, Romanians, and other Eastern European ethnicities. To add insult to injury, farming and hospitality remained two of the most severely underemployed sectors. And this is after the free movement has ended. The biggest reality check was when the Pick for Britain campaign failed miserably because only a limited number of citizens actually wanted to pick for Britain. The ending was inevitable. Racist attacks in the aftermath of the vote, an end to the free movement, and an overall unwelcoming feeling. The Poles knew that it was time to head back home, and the Brits have regretted it ever since. All that being said, do you think Brexit was the right move?